Turn on your projectors and follow me down the rabbit hole. JJ Hatter welcomes you to Analysis in Wonderland. Today's topic, Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, the video game. Movie-based games are nearly as old as video games themselves. The idea behind many video games, not all, but many, is that essentially they put you inside your own movie, either by controlling the main characters or actually being them. It's only natural, therefore, that when a movie makes a big splash, and sometimes even when it doesn't at all, that companies want to try and promote the film by creating video game tie-ins. It's a progression that makes sense. Of course, it's also an established fact that movie-based games rarely manage to be as good as the products on which they are based. This is not to say all the games are bad, mind you. Some games, like the Super Star Wars series, GoldenEye, and Spider-Man 2, are widely regarded as fantastic games. But I think even there, most people will say that the games are great games, but don't necessarily act as improvements on their source materials, if they even match them at all. There are many reasons why, but I'm not here to discuss that. No, I'm here today to discuss one particular movie tie-in game, the 2010 release by Disney Interactive, Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, the video game. Considering the 2010 blockbuster was the second highest grossing film that year, superseded only by another Disney theatrical release, Toy Story 3, it was inevitable that a video game tie-in would be created. There were actually two completely different versions of the game made. The console version, which was made for Windows PC, the Nintendo Wii, and the Zeebo, and a different version made for the Nintendo DS. I'm going to be talking specifically about the console version here. In fact, full disclosure, I haven't actually played the DS version. And while I hear it's actually better than the game I'll be talking about today, and I will admit it certainly looks interesting, the chances of me ever being able to play it are currently quite remote. Of course, if that day ever comes, I'll readily review it. With that said, the console version was a classic third-person cinematic adventure-style game. And it's interesting to note that several of the voice actors in the game were actually those who played their characters in the movie. Mia Wasikowska, Michael Sheen, Barbara Windsor, Stephen Fry, and Crispin Glover all reprised their roles. Leo Bill, who played the snobby Lord Hamish Ascot in both films, also reprises his role here, albeit only for the briefest and most thankless of cameos. The rest of the cast was rounded out by voice talents like Ashley Bell, Roger Craig Smith, Jared Butler, and Dave Wittenberg, just to name a few. The premise of the game more or less follows that of the film, as a grown-up Alice is led back to Wonderland by the White Rabbit to fulfill her destiny. She must find the legendary Vorpal Sword, slay the dragon-like Jabberwock, or Jabberwocky as the movie and game both incorrectly refer to the monster, and thus save the land from the tyranny of the evil Queen Erasabeth. However, while the premise essentially remains the same, the actual plot is very, very different. Among other changes, less focus is put on Alice herself, as the actual playable characters are instead the characters of Wonderland. In order of appearance, the players are able to take control of the White Rabbit, the Dormouse, the March Hare, the Mad Hatter, and the Cheshire Cat, each of whom have special abilities and combat methods to help make their way through Wonderland and aid Alice on her journey. Upon its release, the gaming public rose to a man, proclaiming the title as most assuredly... The game received lukewarm reviews and had modest sales. No one seemed to hate the game, mind you, but nobody could really say it was brilliant either. And yeah, that's basically my thoughts on it as a game, too. And I have to emphasize that. Those are my thoughts on it as a game. If I were to rate this one based on it as a game, period, with no other interests, just a total blind rating, I'd give it a solid 5 out of 10. It doesn't do anything that's terrible, but it's not going to break any records. So why am I even bothering to talk about it? Remember how I said earlier in the video that video games based on films are virtually never as good as the movies themselves? Believe it or not, I honestly believe this release may be the one case I found where the game is better than the movie it's based on. At least, in some ways. I won't be discussing this one so much as a game, mind you, but rather as an adaptation. Of course, the fact it is a game must be taken into account as well, because that's part of what makes this adaptation stand out. But just know that I'm making that distinction. And in comparison to the 2010 film itself, I think that, again, in some ways, the game actually surpasses it. But how can this be? I mean, even just looking at the images in the video, you can probably tell this game is far from a peach cupcake. What does this game do that's actually superior to its movie counterpart? But before I get into the good stuff, I'm actually going to start with the bad stuff. I try to accentuate the positive when I can in general, but I feel I do need to start off with more negative issues for one good reason. Virtually everything that doesn't work in this game can be discussed by focusing largely on one single solitary character. Alice herself. Alice, to be blunt, and everything that surrounds her is the worst part of this entire interpretation. A big part of the reason for this is due to the fact that Alice is not the focus, her guides are. Now this fact by design actually is not necessarily a bad thing. There have been other pieces based on Wonderland, both interactive and non-interactive, where the focus has been less on Alice and more on Wonderland itself. While Alice can be interesting in the proper hands, I think it's fair to say that when people think of this story and this world, we don't necessarily think of Alice first. We think of the Mad Hatter, or the Queen of Hearts, or any of the other crazy characters that surround Alice. That's the point of the original story, experiencing all these wacky and wild and weird characters and places alongside Alice. She is basically our guide. So having a game that flips that, where you play and focus more on the people who inhabit Wonderland, isn't really a bad way to go. For one thing, it helps further reinforce the idea that this is a Wonderland at war. It makes you feel almost like a spy or a rebel, because that's who you're playing as, members of a resistance. Plus, with all the Alice-related games out there, and there are several, most of them seem to either make you play as Alice herself, or as a sort of Alice substitute. Somebody exploring this world anew and encountering the crazy characters we all know and love. This is one of the few games I know of where you instead play as those timeless icons we've come to recognize so well. But JJ, you may be saying, I thought you said this was a bad thing. Well, for Alice it is, because by pushing her to the background, this entire game, and I pretty much do mean the entire game, becomes one gigantic escort mission. And we all know how iffy those can be. To be fair, if I had to escort Alice for just, say, 2 or 3 levels, I wouldn't mind, but for the majority of the game, you're leading Alice around, trying to keep her safe, trying to get to someplace only she can access, etc. The result is that Alice serves almost no purpose beyond just being something you're tied to, and have to constantly look after. On top of that, she's practically useless. For 99% of this game, your 5 characters are the ones doing all the work. She can't defend herself, she's not very good at hiding when trouble strikes, she's nothing but a millstone. The game gives her an ability called the Alice Thread, which is intended to help you from getting lost, but to be perfectly honest, getting lost in this game I found was next to impossible. There are always signs pointing you in some direction or another, and even when they aren't there, your objective becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly. So the Alice Thread is totally pointless. Even the final boss fight against the Jabberwock involves you distracting the creature for most of the fight, and Alice only gets to fight it with some of the briefest and easiest QTE segments imaginable. Alice's lack of agency not only has an effect on the gameplay, but the story too. Her story arc, just like in the movie, is supposed to be one of her gaining confidence and coming into her own as a human being. It's a coming-of-age tale and one intended to show how strong a character Alice can be. This was already problematic in the film, given how passive Wazakowska was at times, but it's exacerbated in the game because she's so utterly useless. How can we be expected to care about her growing and changing if we don't even focus on that growth and change? To top it all off, we come to the visuals and vocal performance. The visuals, as you can plainly tell, are, well, not especially appealing. Granted, the backgrounds and the world around you don't actually look all that bad in my opinion, but the characters lack texture and the cutscene animation tends to be excitable, if that makes sense. Now, for the most part, this isn't necessarily a big issue. I've seen better looking games, of course, but I don't really mind the visual design too much for the most part. And while the cutscene animation is a bit over the top, the in-game animation is smooth as butter, and the movements and expressions of the characters do at least match the voices and performances. For most of the returning cast members, the mindset seems to be, hey, I'm in the video game tie-in. I get to bring these classic characters to life for a new medium. Not only that, but I have a lot more to say and do in the game than I do in the movie. This will be fun! I can't say that these vocal performances will win awards or anything, but they are very good, and you can tell these actors are trying their hardest. There are 2 exceptions. One, as you can imagine, is Leo Bill, who barely has anything to do and whose character is never even seen. and the other is, you guessed it, Mia Wasikowska as Alice, who unfortunately seems to slide into the terrible mindset of, "Hey, I'm in the video game tie-in. It's not like I have to try." Her duller-than-dishwater vocal performance is completely at odds with the hammy melodrama of the animation, and because of that, the issues with the visuals become less easy to forgive. Aside from Alice, there are some other problems. Just like Alice, the Queen of Hearts gets very little focus, and in some ways her situation is even worse. In the first movie, Helena Bonham Carter plays an off-the-wall villainess who is equal parts unnerving, hilarious, and at times sympathetic. In the game, the Queen is played by Tatiana Yasukovich, who does an okay impression of Carter's voice, but comes across as little more than a one-note baddie with no real menace or charm and barely any screen time. When your nominal hero and nominal villain are so horribly pushed aside, it really causes a problem for your story. However, one could argue that's part of the point of the game. It focuses not so much on Alice and the Queen, but on the other people who are engrossed in this conflict. The soldiers, so to speak, who are actively fighting the war. But again, the point with Alice is that she should be fighting too. And considering the Queen was so much fun in the film, it's a shame she's shoved to the background here. In regards to Yasukovich, one should point out that the game-exclusive voice cast is a mixed bag. Dave Wittenberg, for instance, plays the March Hare. Honestly, until very recently, I thought the voice was provided by Paul Whitehouse, who plays the hare in the movies, and Wittenberg's impression is absolutely spot on. He's not as funny as Whitehouse, who is laugh-out-loud hysterical in the films, but because the hare gets more focus in the game, a lot more in fact, he's able to create arguably a much richer character, and the hare is still amusing and, dare I say, even sort of adorable. Jared Butler has a long track record playing Johnny Depp characters in video games, and does a fairly decent job in the role of the Mad Hatter. He not only does a perfect impression of Depp's voice, but still manages to bring something of his own to the role. Tweedledee and Tweedledum pop out throughout the game to provide special missions for the characters and bring attention to various points of interest. Now, unfortunately, I'm not sure who voices these two. Some sources credit them as Dave Wittenberg, but others credit them as being voiced by Roger Craig Smith. Yes, Batman fans, that Roger Craig Smith. If it is him, then I can safely say I never would have guessed it. Aside from these guys, the other actors present are not too terrible, but nothing to write home about. Some of them do good impressions, others don't, but still sound alright, but they never go beyond the call of duty, so to speak. The control in this game is for the most part pretty good. I played this on the Wii, and you can really tell it was built with that platform in mind. Using the different abilities of the characters is interesting, and most of them are fairly easy to get a grasp of, but the Mad Hatter's special power is a bit difficult to handle. The jumping in the game is a bit delayed, and you need to be specific with it, but there thankfully isn't a lot in the way of platforming, so it's not a big issue. The dodge mechanic in combat, however, is almost pointless. In terms of difficulty, it's a bit on the easy side at times, but there is some balance. For example, throughout the game, there are various chess pieces you can gather, and when you visit a shop area, you can purchase power-ups the chess pieces provide. Getting currency for these power-up purchases is ridiculously easy. Practically anything you do or even touch in this game will give you money. However, to balance this out, finding the chess pieces is a little more challenging, often involving puzzle solving and going off the linear path of the game. You won't find them unless you explore. Once you know where they are, of course, and how to get them, it's pretty simple stuff. The combat sections range from pieces of cake to, "Oh God, please make it end!" There are 3 boss fights in the story: the Bandersnatch, the Knave of Hearts, and the Jabberwock. None of them are extremely difficult, but none of them are extremely easy either, and all of them involve puzzle-solving elements to beat them. So far, all of this has more or less just measured out to a game that is, as I said before, meh. Nothing too crazy, nothing too easy, certainly flawed, but far from terrible. So again, you're probably wondering why I think this is better than the movie in some ways, and why I'm so interested in talking about it. In order to explain that, I have to go back to the movie itself. One problem I had with the picture was that, while it was fascinating to see a war-torn, Tim Burtonized Wonderland, even watching the film in 3D in theaters, it was hard to feel completely sucked in my opinion. Also, I felt the film didn't take as much advantage over the utter craziness of this world as it could have, and so while it looked amazing, I still felt they could have been even better. Another problem is that while I loved many of the Wonderland side characters, like the Cheshire Cat and the Dormouse, they were relatively minor figures in the story, and I really wished they could have gotten even more focus. The game fixes these issues. Granted, in putting more focus on the side characters, we do end up sacrificing Alice and the 2 queens, and while few of the actors do terrible work, few of them do brilliant work either. However, the focus itself is nevertheless sharper. If we didn't have the movie to compare this to, I think the amount of focus each character gets would certainly be better here than in the film, and the actors who do a great job make it all worthwhile. I've said a lot of these characters are among my favorite takes on the Wonderland characters, and a lot of that actually comes from this game more than the film. If we had taken the focus from this game and the talent and effort from the first film, all of it, and mixed them together, this would be pretty much perfect. As for getting sucked into Wonderland, the fact this piece is a game by default gives it a significant advantage. We not only get to explore various locations from the film, but also some new locations that are equally fascinating, and being a game, it's able to take advantage of some of the weirdness and backwards logic of Wonderland in a way the movie just could not do. For example, there's a section about halfway through the game simply called the Cabin. At first it seems like a normal spot, albeit one that runs on TARDIS logic, but then you find a hidden vortex and go through a hall that twists you around, and suddenly you find yourself spending part of the level walking on the ceiling. It doesn't stop there either. You then find another vortex, and when you enter this one, you end up in a sort of limbo world, where you find a ruined version of the same location, filled with tricky platforming and crawling with enemies. Then after you get what you need here, you have to go back again through all this nuttiness to find the door Alice must open. It's easily my favorite section of the game, and it's not the only example of how this universe takes greater advantage of the Wonderland world. The design is pretty good too, in my opinion, still capturing that ravaged sort of sensibility, but also allowing itself to be more colorful and vibrant than the movie. It's not always as bright and as healthy as the second film's visuals would later be, nor is it always as dingy and decadent as the 2010 feature. It's somewhere in the middle, with a good balance to it, and I absolutely love it. The element of balance ties into another factor that the game has over the 2010 film, its tone. The 2010 film was totally scattershot, mixing scenes that were very immature and silly with stuff that wasn't just dark, but downright ghoulish at times. The game is more consistent. There is some dark stuff to it, but it's never handled in the same graphic nature as the movie, and a few things are changed completely. And the way they are changed, once again, often helps to take advantage of the wildness you have in Wonderland. For example, in the movie, there's a scene where Alice has to cross a moat filled with decapitated heads. Yuck. In the game, we have a whole sub-level before we get to the castle of Salazar Grum, where Arasabeth dwells, where we need to cross the moat and solve some puzzles there. Instead of water filled with floating heads, the water instead has magical properties, and the sequence allows for a lot of creative imagery and showcases the Cheshire Cat's invisibility talents a great deal. It takes a throwaway moment that was pretty gruesome and turns it into something that lacks the darkness of the movie, but makes up for it with inventive shenanigans and a better use of the backwards logic Wonderland usually runs on. The music is another point of interest. The soundtrack is the work of one Richard Jacques. Once again, I think the soundtrack is in some ways better than the one from the movie. And keep in mind, the movie was the work of Danny Elfman, my favorite film composer of all time, so that's saying a lot. Jacques uses a style that is certainly reminiscent of Elfman, but goes in a totally different direction all its own. Each level and region of the game has its own unique sound design and musical theme to go with it, and a lot of the tracks here are actually more memorable than those in the movie, I feel. The music does a great job of conveying multiple emotions and attitudes, able to be haunting and whimsical in equal amounts, and creates a gorgeous atmosphere. I'd overall go so far as to say it's one of the most underrated game soundtracks ever made. Finally, as I said before, it's just a lot of fun playing as the Wonderland characters, especially these versions of them who, again, are given more balanced focus, and in many cases more richness to them than in the movie. I have nothing against games where you play as Alice or an Alice substitute, like the American McGee games or the Wonderland levels in Kingdom Hearts, but I think most people would much rather be the colorful crazies of Wonderland than play Alice herself. It's the exploration elements and the use of these characters that ultimately win me over. So we come to the conclusions. Ratings, 7 out of 10. This is not a perfect game by any means, but it's the perfect game for me, if that makes sense. If you're a fan of the Tim Burton movies and you haven't played this yet, you should. If you aren't a fan of the films, but still like Alice in general, or even just enjoy fantasy adventure titles, I'd still give it a modest recommendation. It might surprise you. A review on GameZone, I think, summed this whole thing up quite well with these words, and I quote, "It is what it is. A game adaptation of a movie. Slightly offbeat, but accessible." Top 6 performances and characters. Crispin Glover is the Knave of Hearts. Glover was already a gloriously oily character in the film, and I swear he's even more slimy in this one. He's a little over the top, but not to a point where it's painful, and considering he gets more focused than the Queen herself, makes for a fine antagonist. Dave Wittenberg is the March Hare. Not as funny as Paul Whitehouse, but the fact I couldn't tell it wasn't Paul Whitehouse for years is surely a testament to his work here. The only reason he isn't higher is that he's the character I tend to use the least in the game for the simple fact he's the weakest on the battlefield. Jared Butler is the Mad Hatter. Interestingly, despite the Hatter being so focused on in the film, he's one of the last characters you take control of here. I actually think this is good because you still get plenty out of him, and he steals the show after he pops up, but doesn't feel like he overpowers everybody else. Michael Sheen is the White Rabbit, named Nivens McTwisp. This guy is the first one you take control of in the game. Sheen is one of my favorite people to play the White Rabbit, and a lot of what makes him great comes from this game, rather than the movies themselves. Stephen Fry is the Cheshire Cat. When I reviewed the movies, I put Cheshire here pretty low on my top 6, because while I loved the voice and the design, the character himself had little to do. While the graphics deaden the design department slightly, those issues are fixed here. While he's the last character you play as, he still has plenty to do both before and after you take control of him, and Fry's vocals here are just as great as in the movies. And Barbara Windsor as the Dormouse. Again, totally Reepicheep's sister and bearing little resemblance to the character in the books, but I just love little Maliamkin to bits, and in this game she's the character I play as the most. She has no magical abilities like the others, but is instead specifically adapted for combat, and seems to move faster than all of the rest. Windsor's winning performance here makes her an absolute treat, and she's one of the earliest characters you play as, coming very closely after McTwisp. What other wonders await you down the rabbit hole? Join me next time to find out. This is JJ Hatter, and don't forget, we're all mad here.